In this heartwarming and emotional journey, we begin with Wilmer Castro, a man who once believed that happiness had left his life forever after the tragic loss of his beloved wife, Ella. Grieving and feeling lost, Wilmer couldn't imagine finding love again until fate introduced him to Ingrid, a woman who brought light back into his life and became a loving stepmother to his son, Theo. Together, they formed a beautiful new family, filled with hope and dreams for the future. But as life often goes, their happiness was soon overshadowed by unexpected challenges. Theo, once a healthy and joyful child, began to fall ill frequently, casting a shadow of worry over their household. Desperate to help his son, Wilmer found himself making difficult decisions, including sending Theo to a health camp and hiring a nurse, Corey, to care for him. However, when Ingrid's suspicions and jealousy led to Corey's unjust dismissal, the family's world started to unravel. As Theo's health deteriorated and Wilmer's trust in Ingrid wavered, a shocking truth was unveiled. Corey, who had been cast aside, was the key to Theo's recovery and the happiness of the family. Through a series of dramatic and dangerous events, including a life-threatening fire, Corey's bravery and selflessness not only saved Theo but also rekindled a love that Wilmer never thought he would find again. In the end, Wilmer, Theo, and Corey emerged from their trials stronger and more united than ever. Their family grew with the birth of a beautiful baby girl, and Wilmer finally understood that true happiness comes from those who stand by us through the darkest of times. This is a story of love, loss, betrayal, and redemption, showing us that no matter how deep the sorrow, happiness can always find its way back into our hearts. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. After the heartbreaking loss of his cherished wife, Ella, Wilmer Castro, the once invincible leader of a thriving food company, was convinced that love and joy had been forever extinguished from his life. The void left by Ella's passing was vast, a deep chasm of sorrow that seemed impossible to fill. People often say that time heals all wounds, and in his case they spoke of a grief that would linger painfully for 3 long years. During these dark days, Wilmer's mother, Anna, was a constant beacon of hope, gently urging her son forward. "My dear," she would say with a mix of tenderness and urgency, "your son, our little Theo, needs a mother. You must find the strength to continue living. I pray that one day you will meet a wonderful woman who will be a devoted wife to you and a loving mother to Theo. You simply need to open your heart and see the world around you." Then, as if by a twist of fate, the young, grief-stricken widower crossed paths with Ingrid. In just a week, the fog of sorrow that had clouded his heart began to lift, and he realized with startling clarity that Ingrid was the woman destined to walk beside him for the rest of his days. Ingrid's natural warmth quickly won over 6-year-old Theo, forming a bond that melted Wilmer's remaining doubts. It was this tender connection that reassured him, making their blossoming relationship feel like destiny. Only a few short months passed before Wilmer, overcome with renewed hope, proposed to Ingrid, and they celebrated their love with a wedding that was nothing short of magical. Anna, filled with immense joy, breathed a sigh of relief. "Now I can face my final days without fear," she confided, her voice soft with contentment. "You and Theo have found your guardian angel." "Mom, what are you talking about?" Wilmer chided with a smile, trying to dismiss her words as foolish. "Don't be silly. Ingrid and I haven't even given you a granddaughter yet, and you'll definitely be around to dance at Theo's wedding." Their honeymoon in the Seychelles was a dream, a serene escape where the newlyweds could revel in their love. As they returned to start their new life together, Wilmer was convinced that this chapter of his life was going to be filled with nothing but life. As it often does, had other plans. Wilmer soon found himself grappling with a growing sense of dread as Theo began to fall ill far too frequently. Despite Ingrid's boundless love for the boy and her meticulous care, Theo's health seemed to spiral downward. One illness would give way to another, with no respite, first a simple runny nose, then a sore throat, and eventually even bronchitis. Each ailment felt like a cruel twist of fate, casting a shadow over what should have been a time of pure happiness. Wilma, now caught in a storm of worry and helplessness, couldn't understand why his beloved son was suffering so much, despite all of Ingrid's loving efforts to protect him. "Why don't we consider sending Tio to a health camp?" Ingrid suggested, her voice tinged with a mix of concern and hope. Wilma hesitated, his brow furrowing in thought. "But Tio has never been away from home for such a long time," he replied, worry evident in his tone. Ingrid gently pressed on. "Well, there's a first time for everything. It could be a positive experience for him." "Yes, but not at 6 years old," Wilma objected, his voice firm with protective instinct. "It seems too early for him to be far away from his family, alone." Ingrid could see the fear in her husband's eyes, but continued with soft determination. "I understand your concern, truly, but I disagree. This could be really beneficial for Tio. It would help him grow more independent, and more importantly, he'd get some fresh air, a change of environment, and a different climate. Have you ever thought that maybe life in the city isn't what is best for him?" Wilma shook his head slowly, a look of defeat washing over his face. "No, I hadn't thought about that," he admitted, his voice faltering. "Honey, I'm completely lost. I just don't understand anymore. He used to be fine, but now he is constantly sick. I try so hard to shield him from viruses, but it is like nothing I do works." Ingrid's eyes filled with tears as she spoke, her voice trembling. "I am doing everything I can, watching his diet, making sure his room is aired out. I don't want to send him away because I love him so much, but I cannot bear to see him suffer like this. It breaks my heart to watch him struggle." Wilma reached out to comfort her, but he couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness. "Wouldn't it be better to air his room less often? Maybe it is too cold in there," he suggested, grasping for anything that might help. Ingrid shook her head gently, wiping away her tears. "That is not the issue," she explained softly. "It is worse for him when it is too hot, and fresh air helps reduce the germs. But I'm not a doctor, Wilma. In the camp, Tio would be under the care of specialists who know what they are doing." Wilma was silent for a moment, deep in thought. "Maybe you are right," he finally said, his voice tinged with reluctant acceptance. "Perhaps a health camp isn't such a bad idea after all. I'll think about it. Thank you, my love, for everything you do for my son." With that, the devoted father began researching various children's health camps, determined to find the best option for Tio. Before long, he came across a camp that seemed perfect and quickly reached out to the administration. "We offer an individualized approach for each child," said a woman with a warm, reassuring voice. "The minimum stay is 2 months." Wilma nodded to himself as he listened, a sense of cautious optimism beginning to take root in his heart. That sounds promising, he thought, knowing he had to do what was best for his son, even if it meant letting go just a little. 2 months, Wilma echoed, his voice heavy with reluctance. The thought of being separated from his son for such a long time weighed on him. Even though he couldn't quite grasp the full necessity of this trip, he wasn't ready to be apart from Tio for even a single month, let alone 2. "Yes, 2 months, the administrator confirmed calmly. "But don't worry, you are welcome to visit your child whenever you wish. There's no restriction on that." Wilma felt a small wave of relief wash over him. "Well, I suppose that is not so bad," he conceded. "So how do I go about signing him up?" The administrator provided all the necessary details, and with that, the decision was made. Now, all that remained was the daunting task of preparing Tio for the trip. After all, 2 months away from home was no small thing for a young child. But to Wilma's surprise, Tio's eyes lit up at the news. "Will I get to play with other kids there?" Tio asked, his excitement unmistakable. Wilma sighed deeply, realizing just how much his son had been missing out on the simple joys of childhood. Tio had once attended school like any other child, but as the endless colds and illnesses set in, Wilma had reluctantly pulled him out. Now it was clear Ingrid had been right all along. A health camp would be a perfect solution, offering not only a change of scenery, but also the social interaction Tio so desperately needed. However, just a week before the planned departure, Tio complained of a severe headache. Wilma, alarmed, placed his hand on his son's forehead and recoiled in shock. Tio's skin was burning hot, like a furnace. The thermometer confirmed his worst fears, nearly 40 grade C. "Oh God, this is the last thing we need," Wilma muttered in despair as he sank heavily into a chair, his mind racing with worry. Ingrid, drawn by the sound of her husband's distressed words, entered the room. "What is wrong?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "Tio is sick again," Wilma replied grimly, "and it seems pretty serious this time." Ingrid's eyes narrowed with worry as she looked at her stepson. Tio's face was flushed deep red, and beads of sweat were beginning to form on his forehead. "It looks like we all have to postpone the trip," Wilma said with a heavy sigh. "But first, we going straight to the doctor." "Are you sure? We still have a week before we were supposed to leave. Maybe he'll recover in time," Ingrid suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. But the following day brought no improvement. Tio's condition remained the same, and the doctor's verdict was clear: the trip was out of the question. "I would strongly advise you to hire a qualified nurse," the doctor added with a tone of urgency. Wilma nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "I see. Thank you." As the doctor left, Ingrid's frustration boiled over. "Why do we need a nurse?" she exclaimed. "Why bring a stranger into our home? I can take care of Tio." Wilma, however, was resolute. "Do you have medical training?" he interrupted, his voice firm and unyielding. "Well, no, but—" "Then there's nothing more to discuss," Wilma cut her off. "Tonight, I'll go to the agency's website and find a nurse." Ingrid saw the determination in her husband's eyes, understanding that his decision was final. She knew better than to argue further, especially when it came to his son's well-being. With a reluctant nod, she accepted the inevitable. The safety and health of Tio were paramount, and if that meant bringing in professional help, then so be it. "All right then," Wilma said, his tone firm yet gentle. "I have to head to the office now. Keep a close eye on Tio, and if anything happens, don't hesitate to call me." After finishing his urgent tasks at work, Wilma's thoughts were consumed with getting back home. Although he had complete faith in Ingrid, there was a part of him that couldn't rest easy unless Tio was within his sight. On his way home, as he crossed the bridge, something unusual caught his eye: a young girl, barely an adult, dressed in tattered clothes, standing alone by the railing. There was something deeply unsettling about her demeanor, a lost, distant look in her eyes. Suddenly, she swung one leg over the railing, clearly preparing to jump. Wilma's heart skipped a beat as he slammed on the brakes, his car screeching to a halt. "What on earth are you doing?" he shouted, rushing over and grabbing the girl, pulling her away from the edge with a forceful grip. "Are you really that tired of living?" "Yes," she choked out through sobs, her voice thick with despair. "This isn't it living, it is just endless suffering. Come on, let this get you to the car," Wilma commanded, his voice softening but still firm, as he guided her toward his vehicle. After a brief moment of hesitation, the girl complied, her steps slow and unsteady. "What is your name?" Wilma asked, trying to inject some warmth into his tone. "Corey," the girl answered in a timid voice, barely above a whisper. "Corey, tell me," Wilma began gently, "why would a young, beautiful girl like you think that life is nothing but suffering?" "I am pregnant," Corey whispered, her voice breaking as tears streamed down her face. "Congratulations," Wilma said, though his tone carried a mix of reproach and concern. "But do you really think the answer is to destroy not only your life but also that of your innocent child?" "My fiancé left me," Corey continued, her sobs growing more intense. "I trusted him, and he betrayed me in the cruelest way." "I see." Wilma nodded, his heart aching for the young woman. "But that is still no reason to take your life and the life of your child. You both deserve so much more." "It is easy for you to say," Corey sighed, her voice laced with bitterness. "You have no idea what it is like to be so alone, with no one to turn to and nowhere to go." "What about your parents?" Wilma asked, hoping there might be some support she hadn't considered. Corey's face darkened with painful memories. Her father had abandoned the family when she was just 2 years old, leaving her mother to raise her alone. When Corey was 14, her mother met Bob, a man who initially seemed like a blessing. He moved into their small village home and took on all the repairs that had been long neglected. For the first few months, life felt almost idyllic, as if their luck had finally turned. But then the dark side of Bob's nature began to emerge. His bouts of drunkenness grew more frequent and severe, turning their once peaceful home into a place of fear and turmoil. "So that is your story," Wilma said, his voice filled with understanding and sorrow. "But Corey, even with all the pain you've endured, ending your life and your baby's life isn't the solution." Corey stared out the window, her tears slowly drying, though the weight of her despair still hung heavily in the air. Wilma could see that she was at a crossroads, teetering on the edge of a decision that would change everything. "You don't tend to do this alone," Wilma continued softly. "There are people who can help, and I can help you find them. You and your baby deserve a chance. Don't take that away." Corey looked at him, a glimmer of hope struggling to surface in her tired eyes. For the first time in a long while, she considered the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of her darkness that didn't involve the finality she had been contemplating. "Mom, why don't you just kick him out?" Corey pleaded, her voice filled with frustration and confusion. "Why do you even keep him around?" Her mother sighed deeply, a weary sadness in her eyes. "You wouldn't understand," she said softly. "Even though he's no good, he does all I have left." But then, life dealt a cruel blow. Corey's mother fell gravely ill, diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. The disease progressed rapidly, consuming her like a flame devours a candle. In just a few short months, the woman who had been Corey's entire world was gone. Bob, her stepfather, however, refused to leave. "I am registered here," Bob stated coldly, "so I am not going anywhere." Living with Bob, a man she barely knew and certainly didn't trust, felt like an unbearable weight on Corey's shoulders. Yet, she was powerless to change the situation, as Bob had every legal right to stay. Desperately seeking an escape, Corey found solace in a new relationship with Steve. The young couple moved in together, renting a small apartment, and for a brief moment, Corey allowed herself to hope for a better future. But when she told Steve about her pregnancy, his reaction shattered those hopes. Instead of joy, Steve was filled with resentment, and Corey found herself once again alone, forced to move out of their shared home. Meanwhile, Wilma had no reason to doubt Ingrid's judgment. Though Ingrid had taken an immediate dislike to the nurse, Wilma knew his wife well enough to understand that baseless accusations weren't his style. Ingrid loved Theo and wanted only the best for him. Despite her initial misgivings, even she couldn't deny that Corey's presence had been beneficial for the boy. Yet, there was no escaping the fact that the security camera hadn't caught Corey in the act, but it had shown her with the missing purse in her hands, a damning piece of evidence. Wilma understood the harsh reality. When people are desperate, they may do things they'd never consider otherwise. Ingrid, however, was not ready to let the matter go. "How do you know what kind of trouble she's really in?" she pressed. "Maybe she owes someone money. What do you actually know about her, beyond what she has told you?" "Nothing." Wilma had to admit his wife had a point. The old saying, "No matter how much you feed the wolf, it's still going to look at the forest," echoed in his mind. Sadly, the truth seemed clear. Corey had likely stolen the money. After their conversation, Ingrid poured herself a glass of white wine, savoring the exotic fruit flavors as she indulged in a quiet moment of satisfaction. She had achieved her goal. "You have had your taste of a good life," she thought, her mind steeped in cold bitterness. "But at this time you return to your usual, worthless existence." As Ingrid relished in her small victory, the darkness of her thoughts was a stark contrast to the pristine surroundings of their home, a place where trust had been eroded and suspicion had taken root. For Corey, it was yet another chapter in a life that seemed to spiral endlessly downward, as she faced the harsh reality of being pushed out once again, back into the unforgiving world that had never shown her much kindness. "Where's Corey?" Theo asked in a small, worried voice as his stepmother entered his room that evening. "Corey doesn't work for us anymore," Ingrid replied with a casual shrug, walking over to the window and pushing it open. Why? Tia's voice trembled with hurt and confusion. Because your precious Corey stole my money, Ingrid said, her tone dripping with satisfaction. That is not true. Corey is good. You airy the one who does bad. Tio shot back, his young heart pounding with anger and disbelief. Ingrid smirked, her eyes cold. Believe what you want. I don't tear, she said dismissively. Please close the window, Tio pleaded. I am cold. Ingrid hesitated for a moment, then reluctantly closed the window, a slight frown crossing her face. The next day, Tio was feeling worse. His small body was feverish, and his cheeks flushed an alarming red. I feel bad, he whispered, his voice barely audible. What is wrong with you now? Ingrid muttered, rolling her eyes in annoyance. She was growing impatient with his constant complaints. Give me the syrup, Tio asked quietly, hoping for some relief. What syrup? Ingrid snapped, her frustration bubbling over. You don't even know what you're asking for. And why do you keep going on about Corey? I'd have already told you she is a thief, and that is the end of it. Do you understand? Tio, though young, was perceptive beyond his years. He knew there was no point in arguing with Ingrid. She wouldn't give him what he needed. I'll wait for Daddy, he decided, feeling a pang of sadness in his chest. Ingrid handed him the syrup without much care and left the room. She considered opening the window again, but when Tio shivered and said he was very cold, she thought better of it and left it closed. Yet the chill in the room wasn't just from the cool air, it was from the growing emptiness in Tio's heart. As the days passed, Tio began to wither, and it wasn't just the illness that was wearing him down. He felt a deep, aching loneliness. Corey had been the one person who truly cared for him, who made him feel safe and loved. His father, though full of love, was often too busy with work to be there when Tio needed him most. Ingrid, on the other hand, seemed more interested in herself and Wilma's money than in Tio's well-being. The boy could sense that, and it hurt him deeply. The warmth and care that Corey had given him were gone, replaced by the cold indifference of a stepmother who seemed to see him as nothing more than an inconvenience. As for Corey, her situation quickly deteriorated after being dismissed in such a dishonorable manner. With no place to go, she spent 2 long, sleepless nights in a dingy hostel, her mind racing with worry about what would come next. Desperately clinging to hope, she set out in search of some kind of shelter. Surely there are still kind people in the world, Corey thought, trying to reassure herself. Maybe someone will offer me a place to stay in exchange for help with household chores, or perhaps they'll let me stay on loan until I can pay them back. But as the hours ticked by and doors closed in her face, Corey's hopes began to crumble. No one was willing to offer her even the smallest corner of their home. Still, she refused to give in to despair. What other choice did she have? Determined to find a solution, Corey decided to revisit the neighborhood where she and Steve had once rented an apartment. The area was notorious for its high crime rate, which kept the rent low, a blessing for those with nowhere else to turn. By some stroke of luck, or perhaps fate, she found a man willing to rent her a tiny apartment. But luck, as it turned out, was a relative term. The landlord, who lived in the adjacent apartment, was a heavy drinker. The apartment was a grim sight, filthy and reeking of stale cigarette smoke, but it was a roof over her head, and for Corey, that was enough. I expect the money in a month, the landlord slurred, his breath reeking of alcohol. Deal, Corey replied, her voice filled with forced enthusiasm as she nodded heartily. She had no choice but to find work, and fast. Corey knew that she couldn't mention her pregnancy during her job search. Employers would turn her away immediately if they knew. Meanwhile, her landlord would drop by unannounced, pestering her about the rent. It hasn't been a month yet, has it? Corey would reply each time, her patience wearing thin. She suspected that the man was desperate for money to fuel his drinking habit, and he would gladly take the rent early if he could get it. Finally, after days of relentless searching, Corey managed to secure a job at a food delivery service. We pay weekly, the administrator told her, and a wave of relief washed over Corey. It was more than she had dared to hope for. The pay was decent, and by her calculations, she would be able to pay the rent on time just barely. Though her circumstances were far from ideal, Corey felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in weeks. She was determined to make it work, not just for herself, but for the tiny life growing inside her. The road ahead was uncertain and fraught with challenges, but Corey resolved to face it with all the strength she could muster. After all, survival was her only option. After a week of hard work, Corey finally felt a small sense of accomplishment. She had managed to fill the fridge with groceries and set aside enough money for the rent. But her brief moment of relief was quickly overshadowed by misfortune. One day, while on the job, Corey began to feel unwell. She was leaving a shopping center, her arms loaded with heavy bags of groceries to deliver, when suddenly everything went black. She fainted, collapsing right there on the sidewalk. The panicked administrator at the delivery service quickly called for an ambulance. When Corey regained consciousness, she found herself in a hospital bed, a doctor standing beside her with a concerned look. "In your condition, carrying such heavy weights isn't safe," the doctor explained gently. "You gently, at risk of a miscarriage. You need to stay here for a couple of days to rest and recover." Corey sighed heavily, the weight of her situation pressing down on her. She had only worked 2 days that week, and the thought of not being paid filled her with dread. No work, no money, she thought miserably. How will I pay the rent now? The only silver lining was that the hospital was far more comfortable than the shabby apartment she was forced to call home. Desperate, Corey called her landlord to explain the situation and ask for an extra week to pay the rent. She mentioned that she was in the hospital, hoping to appeal to whatever shred of kindness the man might have left. After all, he had been somewhat lenient with her so far, and she prayed he would extend that leniency just a bit further. But this time, the landlord's patience had worn thin. "I don't care about your problems," he cut her off abruptly. "Do you have any money at all?" "Yes," Corey replied, her voice trembling. "It is in the kitchen cupboard under the blue teapot." She hoped that by showing him she had some money, he might be convinced to give her a little more time. But Corey's hope was naive. "That is good," the landlord replied, his tone suddenly more cheerful. "I'll take all the money. That will cover 1 month's rent and compensate me for the inconvenience of waiting. And don't bother coming back. I don't need such irresponsible tenants around here." Corey felt her heart sink. "Where can I leave the key?" she asked, her voice hollow with despair. "At the city hospital," she answered gloomily. "I'll leave it with the lady on duty." With that, Corey hung up the phone, her mind reeling from the harsh reality of her situation. She was now not only homeless, but also completely penniless. The little security she had managed to scrape together had been snatched away in an instant. As she lay in the hospital bed, the world seemed to close in around her, leaving her with nothing but the cold, hard truth. She was alone, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. Yet, in the midst of her despair, she knew she had to keep going for the sake of her unborn child, if nothing else. "Why aren't you eating?" Ingrid asked, her eyes narrowing as she watched Tio push the pasta around his plate without taking a bite. "I don't want to," Tio mumbled, his voice laced with defiance as he shoved the plate away. The truth was, Tio missed Corey terribly, but he knew better than to mention her to Ingrid. Every time he brought her up, it only led to more cursing and accusations from his stepmother, who was adamant that Corey was a thief. When Wilma returned home from a business trip, he greeted his family with a cheerful, "How is everyone?" "Fine," Ingrid purred, planting a kiss on her husband's cheek. Wilma smiled, pleased to be back. "That's great. Where is Tio?" he asked. "In his room," Ingrid replied, her tone casual. But when Wilma walked into Tio's room, he was taken aback. The sight of his son left him speechless, his mouth hanging open in shock. Tio looked pale and gaunt, a shadow of the vibrant boy he had left behind. His heart sank. "Are you sick again?" he asked, worry threading through his voice. "Dad, can Corey come back?" Tio whispered, a single tear slipping down his pale cheek. Wilma was at a loss. He had hoped that the boy would be doing better, not worse. "Sonny, I would love for her to come back, but it is impossible," he said, his voice tinged with despair. Wilma looked at Ingrid, searching her face for answers. Had Tio been told about the alleged theft? Ingrid nodded slightly, confirming his suspicion. "Daddy, I know Ingrid thinks Corey stole the money," Tio said, his voice trembling but resolute. "But that is not true. Corey is good and Ingrid is bad." I was cold, and she opened the window. Ingrid, unable to hold back any longer, snapped, "What are you talking about, good or bad? It is not that simple." "Ingrid, don't yell at the child," Wilma interjected quietly but firmly, his gaze steady. Ingrid hesitated, caught off guard by her husband's tone. "I am sorry," she stammered, trying to regain her composure. "But you have to understand." "I do understand," Wilma said, cutting her off gently. "But when I left, Tio got sick again. Isn't it that reason enough to, at least, consider his request?" Ingrid stared at her husband in disbelief. "Are you seriously thinking about bringing her back?" she asked, incredulous. Wilma nodded, his expression resolute. "If it would help Tio, then yes. And besides, I want to hear Corey's side of the story. We only heard one perspective, and I think it is time we find out the truth." Without wasting any time, Wilma began his search for Corey. It wasn't going to be easy. She had no permanent address, no stable place to call home. All he had was the address of the apartment she had once shared with the father of her child, but they had broken up, and it seemed unlikely that she would return there after such a betrayal. Still, it was the only lead he had, and he knew he had to try. The thought of Tio suffering while the truth remained unknown gnawed at him, fueling his determination. If there was even the slightest chance of finding Corey and bringing her back, he was going to take it, no matter how difficult the search might be. The neighborhood was run down and worn, a stark contrast to the polished and successful businessman who now found himself walking its streets. Wilma, feeling like a fish out of water, moved through the area cautiously, showing Corey's picture to anyone who would spare him a glance. But time and again he was met with indifferent shrugs or blank stares. It seemed like his search would end in frustration, leaving him empty-handed. Just as he was about to give up, fortune finally turned in his favor. A woman, probably in her 40s, wearing a faded floral dress and a worn-out sweater, approached him. "Yes, I saw this girl yesterday," she nodded, pointing to the picture. "She rented an apartment in that house over there, on the first floor." Wilma's heart leaped with hope. "Thank you very much," he said sincerely, and he headed straight for the building she had indicated. As he reached the entrance, he noticed 3 disheveled, drunken men lounging nearby. Taking a deep breath, he approached them. "Gentlemen, has any of you rented an apartment to a woman named Corey?" One of the men, grinning through the gaps in his teeth, replied, "Well, let's just say it is me." Wilma, sensing the man's interest was more financial than conversational, pressed, "Let us say, or is it really you?" "Yeah, she was my tenant," the man confirmed, his eyes now locked on Wilma, clearly sizing him up for any potential gain. Wilma quickly deduced what was going on. "He's hoping to squeeze some money out of me," he thought, but he was willing to pay if it meant finding Corey. "Whatever you ask," he resolved silently, "as long as the information is useful." For 50 dull Mail learned that Corey had indeed been renting the apartment from this man, but he had kicked her out due to non-payment of rent. "And do you have any idea where she might be now?" Wilma asked, though his hopes for a useful answer were slim. The man shrugged but then added, "The day before yesterday, she was at the city hospital. She called me, begging for another week, but I told her no. I am not running a charity here." Wilma's face tightened with frustration as he handed over the money and walked away. What kind of person kicks a pregnant woman out of her home? He thought, seething with anger. Then again, what else could I expect from someone like that? His thoughts were heavy with indignation as he made his way to the city hospital, determined to find Corey and bring her back. The situation was more dire than he had imagined, but knowing where to look next renewed his determination. He couldn't let Corey's fate spiral further downward, not when she had been so important to Tio. Now, more than ever, Wilma was resolved to bring her back into their lives, whatever it took. As Wilma pieced together the events that had led to Corey's dismissal, a troubling realization dawned on him. If Corey, as Ingrid had insisted, had stolen the money, why had she been unable to pay even the meager rent for that shabby apartment? The answer was glaringly obvious. Corey hadn't stolen anything, and Ingrid had likely never paid her a penny for her work. A deep sense of guilt washed over Wilma. Corey had worked diligently for almost an entire month, caring for Tio so well that the boy had not only recovered but also become deeply attached to her. "I have to find her," Wilma resolved, his determination solidifying as he made his way to the city hospital, hoping and praying that Corey was still there. When he found her, Corey greeted him with a sad smile, and the words "threatened miscarriage" sent a jolt of nervousness through Wilma's heart. One thing led to another, and I ended up getting sick right at work. "That is how I ended up here," she explained, her tone weary and resigned. Wilma felt a surge of regret. This wasn't the fate he had envisioned for the woman who had so capably cared for his son. "Did they at least treat you well at work?" he asked, his eyebrows knitting together in concern. Corey nodded slightly. "Yes, they did. After Ingrid kicked me out, I had to find another job, and I got one at a delivery service. But then, well, this happened." Wilma took a deep breath, realizing it was time to address the elephant in the room. "Corey, it is the reason for your dismissal that I need to discuss with you. It is a delicate matter." He hesitated, unsure of how to continue, but Corey stepped in to help. "Mr. Castro, I didn't steal your wife's purse. Yes, I did pick it up, but I didn't look inside. I only meant to return it to her," she said, her voice trembling with desperation and truth. Wilma listened intently, and he knew in his heart that she was telling the truth. "I believe you," he said quietly, sincerity clear in his tone. "And I want to offer you the chance to come back." Corey looked uncertain, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I'd like that, but I'll handle my wife," Wilma assured her, his tone firm. "You don't need to worry about that." "Well, if that is the case, then I agree," Corey said, a small flicker of hope returning to her eyes. Wilma smiled, relieved that she had accepted his offer. "Good. Now rest and take care of yourself," he encouraged her gently. "We're looking forward to having you back." As he left the hospital, Wilma felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had made a mistake in trusting Ingrid's accusations without verifying the truth, but now he was determined to make things right. Corey's return would not only bring Tio the care and warmth he desperately needed, but also restore a sense of justice to their household. For Wilma, this was a step toward healing the fractures that had formed in their lives, and he knew it was the right thing to do. The doctors worked tirelessly, and thanks to their efforts, Corey's pregnancy was saved. The day of her discharge was marked by a special visit. Both Wilma and Tio came to bring her home. "I'm so glad you're coming back," Tio said earnestly, his young eyes serious as he looked up at Corey. When Ingrid saw Corey return, she pressed her lips together tightly, displeasure clear on her face, though she kept her thoughts to herself. She felt cornered, unsure of what her next move should be. "These beggars," Ingrid thought bitterly. "They are like weeds. No matter how hard you try to get rid of them, they just keep coming back." Ingrid knew that trying to set Corey up again was pointless. Wilma wouldn't fall for it a second time. And as much as it pained her to admit, Corey's return brought immediate improvements. Tio quickly began to recover. His cheeks grew round and rosy once more, and he was visibly happier. He loved spending time with his nanny, who took him on adventures to the zoo, amusement parks, and other places filled with joy for a young child. One day, while at the park, Tio and Corey found a stray puppy, which they brought home and named Finn. The addition of the puppy filled the house with even more happiness, but despite the joy around him, something continued to gnaw at Wilma. "Corey, you're simply a magician," Wilma said one day, marveling at the transformation in his son. "Tio seems healthier, stronger, and genuinely happier. What is your secret?" Corey blushed slightly, embarrassed by the praise. "No magic at all," she replied modestly. "The first thing I did was move Tio to another room. That was the most important step. I made sure the air temperature was just right and that he got the right medications. That's all there is to it." At the mention of temperature, Wilma was suddenly struck by a memory: Tio's words about Ingrid opening the window when he was cold. "I was cold, and she opened the window," Tio had said. A disturbing realization began to form in Wilma's mind. Could this simple act have been the cause of his son's persistent illnesses. He recalled how he had often wondered why Teoda's room seemed so damp, why the air always felt heavy and cool, no matter what he did. Initially, he had assumed it was a construction issue, perhaps a flaw that led to increased humidity, which in turn caused Teoda's frequent colds. He had even considered suing the construction company. But now, a far more chilling thought took hold. What if Ingrid had been deliberately lowering the temperature in Teo's room? The idea was horrifying, yet it explained so much Ingrid's insistence on sending Teo to a health camp, her cold demeanor, and the fact that Teo only recovered once he was out of that room. But how could Wilma accuse his wife of something so sinister without concrete evidence? The thought of her intentionally harming Teo was too terrible to accept without proof, so he decided to order an independent investigation. Deep down, he hoped he was wrong, that the woman he had married couldn't possibly be capable of such cruelty. As the days passed, the strain between Wilma and Ingrid grew. Their once solid relationship now seemed fragile, held together by a thread. Ingrid, sensing Wilma's growing distance, tried to reassert her influence. One day she casually brought up a topic that had always been a point of contention for her, whether it was appropriate for the servants to eat at the same table as the family. The question hung in the air, loaded with implications. It was a subtle jab, a reminder of the social boundaries she believed should be enforced, boundaries that Corey seemed to blur with her presence. Wilma, however, was no longer willing to entertain such notions. His focus had shifted entirely. He needed to uncover the truth about his wife and protect his son at all costs. The investigation would soon reveal whether his fears were justified, or whether he had allowed suspicion to cloud his judgment. Either way, there was no turning back now. The servants, maybe, Wilma replied calmly, but Corey has become more than that to Teo and me. She's a member of our family now. She saved my son's life, and for that, I will be grateful to her for the rest of my life. Ingrid's expression darkened, and then, suddenly, tears began to roll down her cheeks. "Fine, I understand now," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "If you don't need me here anymore, then it's time to end this charade. Wilma, I'm filing for divorce. I can't stay married to a man who doesn't love me at all." With those words, she stood up abruptly and ran upstairs to her bedroom, expecting him to follow. But Ingrid's tears were nothing more than a ploy. She had no real intention of getting a divorce. She simply hoped that Wilma would chase after her, beg for her forgiveness, and agree to fire Corey as her condition for staying. Ingrid had always used manipulation to get what she wanted, but this time, she underestimated her opponent. Much to her shock, Wilma not only agreed to the divorce but did so willingly. He calmly signed the papers and informed Ingrid that he intended to give her everything she was entitled to, which, thanks to a well-crafted prenuptial agreement, amounted to nothing. Ingrid, who had counted on securing a comfortable life post-divorce, was left with nothing but her pride in tatters. "Be grateful I'm not pressing charges for the money you took from the safe," Wilma remarked coolly after the divorce proceedings were finalized. "You really thought I wouldn't sting?" Ingrid shot him a look of pure hatred, but Wilma remained unmoved. "And just so you know," he added, a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth, "it wasn't me who filed for divorce. That was your doing." With that, he handed her the results of the independent examination that confirmed her cruel actions. "Goodbye, Ingrid. I wish you the best of luck finding your next victim." "To hell with you," Ingrid spat, her heels clicking angrily as she stormed away. Her mind raced with fury and humiliation. "How could I have been so foolish?" she fumed inwardly. "But don't I think you've seen the last of me, Wilma. He who laughs last, laughs best." That same evening, Ingrid returned to the house she had once shared with Wilma, but this time she wasn't there to reconcile. Armed with a can of gasoline and a lighter, she was determined to exact her revenge. As she poured the gasoline around the exterior of the house, her mind was filled with thoughts of making them all pay: Wilma, Corey, even little Teo. Inside, Corey and Teo were oblivious to the danger lurking outside. They were enjoying a peaceful evening, playing board games, while Finn, their loyal puppy, wandered happily around the room. Wilma was expected home any minute. "It smells like something's burning," Teo remarked suddenly, wrinkling his nose in confusion. Corey paused, her senses suddenly on high alert. She sniffed the air and, in the next instant, was horrified to see flames flickering outside the window. Panic surged through her. "Corey, I am scared," Tio cried, his small voice trembling with fear. "Stay calm, sweetheart," Corey said, her voice soothing despite the fear gripping her heart. She scooped Tio up in her arms and rushed toward the door, her mind racing as she tried to figure out the best way to get them both to safety. As she opened the door, the flames were already licking at the walls of the house, and thick smoke began to fill the air. Corey knew they had only moments to escape. Clutching Tio tightly, she ran as fast as she could, her only thought being to get him out of danger. Finn followed closely behind, barking frantically as the fire spread. Just as they reached the front yard, Wilma arrived, his eyes widening in horror at the sight of his burning home. He sprang into action, helping Corey and Tio to the safety of his car before calling the fire department. Ingrid watched from a distance, her face twisted in a malicious grin as she saw the flames engulfing the house. But her satisfaction was short-lived. The sirens of the fire trucks grew louder, and Wilma's car sped away with his family safe inside. As the reality of what she had done began to sink in, Ingrid's sense of triumph faded, replaced by a cold, sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach. She had lost everything: her husband, her home, and now any chance of redemption. All that was left was the bitter knowledge that her final act of revenge had failed to destroy the one thing she hated most: their happiness. But for Wilma, Corey, and Tio, the fire was a wake-up call, a reminder of the lengths to which some people will go out of spite and jealousy. They would rebuild, not just their home, but their lives, stronger and more united than ever. And Ingrid, she would be left to face the consequences of her actions, alone and consumed by the very bitterness that had driven her to ruin. They couldn't afford to waste a second. The fire was rapidly spreading, threatening to block their only path to safety. Corey, her heart pounding, placed Tio gently on the grass, away from the flames, and took a moment to catch her breath. "I've already called the fire department," a neighbor shouted, running over to them. Suddenly, Tio's eyes widened in panic. "There's Finn," he squealed, pointing toward the house. Corey's heart clenched. She couldn't believe the poor puppy to perish in the flames. Without a second thought, she rushed back into the blazing inferno. The heat was suffocating, the smoke thick, but all Corey could think about was saving Finn. Just as she reached the emergency exit with the terrified dog in her arms, a deafening explosion echoed through the night, and the house collapsed like a house of cards. Wilma, driving toward his home, was met with a horrifying sight. The house he had poured so much of his heart and soul into was now engulfed in a massive fire. He pressed the gas pedal, speeding up, his mind racing with fear. As soon as he arrived, he jumped out of the car, frantic. "Where's my son?" he shouted desperately. One of the firefighters quickly reassured him. "The boy is safe at the neighbor's." Wilma rushed toward the neighbor's house, his heart pounding with both fear and hope. "Corey," Tio stammered, his small body shaking from the shock, "and Finn." "They took her to the hospital," the neighbor said gently, "but she's seriously hurt." Without wasting another moment, Wilma sped to the hospital, his heart heavy with dread. Upon arrival, he learned that Corey was in stable condition. Her hands and feet had suffered burns, but thankfully, her life and the life of their unborn child were not in danger. As luck would have it, Corey had managed to escape through the emergency exit in the kitchen just before the house collapsed. Wilma sat by her bedside, watching her sleep under sedation. He held her hand, his heart filled with a mix of relief and unspoken emotions. Only now did he realize just how deeply he had come to care for her. "I never had time to tell you that I love you," he whispered softly, squeezing Corey's hand gently. The house was a total loss, destroyed beyond repair, but fortunately it was insured. Security cameras had captured everything, including Ingrid setting the fire. However, instead of being jailed, Ingrid was declared insane and was committed to a psychiatric hospital. As the days passed, Corey's condition steadily improved. Wilma and Tio visited her often, bringing warmth and love to her recovery. One day, as they sat by her side, Wilma couldn't tackle the question that had been weighing on his mind. "Why did you risk your life like that?" he asked, his voice filled with a mixture of admiration and concern. Corey smiled softly, her eyes warm as she looked at Tio. But it is your son's favorite puppy, and we found him in the park together. We tamed him, and as you know, we are responsible for those we have tamed. Wilma's heart swelled with love and gratitude. Then you're responsible for me too, Corey, he whispered, taking her hands in his. After this accident, I realized just how much you mean to me. I can't let you go, not now, not ever if you'll have me. Corey's eyes shimmered with tears, but they were tears of happiness. Yes, she whispered back, her heart full. Corey underwent a rehabilitation course, and her strength returned. Not long after, she and Wilma were married in a small, intimate ceremony filled with love and hope for the future. As New Year's Eve approached, Corey suddenly felt the first signs that their baby was ready to make her entrance into the world. That night, a beautiful baby girl was born, filling the Castro home with even more joy and love. This new year was the best in Wilma's life. His family had grown, not just in size, but in happiness, and he knew without a doubt that this was what made life worth living. Together, they faced the future, stronger and more united than ever, ready to embrace whatever came their way. And that's the end of this powerful story. We've witnessed how love, determination, and courage can overcome even the darkest of challenges. But now, it's your turn. What have you learned from this journey? What lesson from Wilma, Corey, or Tio's experiences will you bring into your own life? We'd love to hear your thoughts, so please comment below with one thing you've learned and plan to apply in your own life. If you enjoyed this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiring true stories. Thank you for watching.